I was never an avid believer in the divine. Not since I was a little girl, anyway. If anything, I used to mock the concept of a deity. Even though I was raised in a Catholic household with my mother, my father, and my 3 younger siblings, religion never quite grew on me the way it did the rest of my family. Every time that I folded my hands together in praying, I would always be left dissatisfied upon being met with no answer from the Lord himself. Just silence. Needless to say, as I got older, the struggles of adapting to adulthood came crashing down on me on various occasions. Bullying, depression, and things like that became a daily part of my routine. And I found a different sense of God in things like bottles of alcohol or packets of cigarettes as a result. Not to say that I became addicted in my youthful years, but if you were to ask me who I'd prefer to return to in an hour of need, a pack of Marlboro would put God to shame any day. After I graduated high school, I moved out of my home into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of town to get away from my family. In a sense, it put more distance between me and God, if anything. Since going to college was out of the question with my grades, I settled for simple jobs. Some of them were easy, others not so much, but at some point, I landed a job as a bartender in the local area. The work was simple enough and I got the hang of it, and the pay wasn't the worst either, so it was perfect for me. It beat retail by a mile or two at the very least. Well, it used to. However, given recent events, I can never quite look at a bottle of wine the same way. In fact, I'm just about ready to attend church again, though not for the reasons that you might imagine. I tell this story sometimes when I'm out and whoever happens to sit next to me is willing to lend an ear or two. Of course, few if any people believe it, even when drunk, and I can't blame them. To this day, I don't know if I believe it myself, but one thing is certain. I will never scoff at religion ever again. It was at 2 o'clock on a Saturday night, and I was working alone. Considering that the area the bar was located at wasn't too large, we didn't have a lot of people coming by at once, so it was easy to tend to the place by myself. Sure, some customers were trickier than others, but I knew enough to keep myself safe from whatever shenanigans drunk patrons could hide up their sleeves. And then something strange happened. A young boy, hardly old enough to enter a bar, much less buy a drink, approached the counter. His hair was short but ashen, as if age had already claimed some attributes from his otherwise youthful appearance. And he wore peculiar clothes that looked like they didn't quite belong to this decade. I was confused at first, to say the least, but also slightly amused. At times, we had underage kids trying to sneak in with fake IDs, but they were usually discreet about their infiltration. This kid, on the other hand, wasn't even trying to keep his intentions in the dark. He didn't even look like he intended to drink. "May I have an ID, kid?" I asked and leaned over the counter, hand outstretched as I waited for something I knew wouldn't arrive. "I don't have any," he replied carelessly. "Well, the crap, then I can't serve you. Come back in a few days and then maybe we'll see," I added humorously, and gestured for him to use the door. But the boy didn't as much as move. He simply stared at me, eyes shining like liquid gold in the dark of the bar. His smile stretched a bit further up his cheeks, and I would be lying if I said that it didn't slightly unnerve me, even if he was just a child. "Can I ask you something, miss?" he finally said after a couple of minutes of deliberate silence. I initially intended to tell him that he had to leave, but for reasons I couldn't quite decipher, I decided to humor his inquiry. What is it? Do you believe in God? Whatever snarky response I had planned in the back of my brain soon came to an immediate halt as I processed those words. Did I believe in God? What kind of child would ask such a question in a bar of all places? That's an odd question, I answered. Why are you asking? He simply shrugged and leaned slightly over the counter, as if to take a better look at me with those golden eyes of his. In turn, I straightened my back and tried my best to hide how uneasy this kid was making me feel by simply being there. It was as if his eyes could stare straight through my soul, assuming that I had one, and whatever secrets I intended to keep from him would come clean out of me if he just said the word. Why are you not answering? He asked innocently, but I could tell that there was something ulterior creeping beneath his childish facade that had yet to reach the surface. Having heard enough, I decided that it was time to send him home. Look, kid, you can't be here. You need to leave. But as firm as my words may have sounded, goosebumps were spreading across my skin like wildfire, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep myself composed. The boy's expression didn't falter in the slightest. They won't mind. He gestured to the few patrons who remained in the bar without breaking eye contact with me. They're too cooped up in their own worlds, stooping down in whatever fantasies their liquor can provide. They won't mind me sitting here for a few minutes. There was something unnatural about the way that he talked. His voice was light and youthful, as you would expect from someone who would barely seem like they are older than 14 at the most. But it didn't quite fit in my book. He didn't seem young. He looked ancient, older than those whose names have long vanished in the earth. Who are you? I finally asked. He proceeded to fold his hands together while resting his chin on top of them, tilting his head ever so slightly to give me a mesmerizing look that would remain ingrained in my brain for years to come. Joseph, he answered. To be honest, I have a lot of names, but you may call me Joseph to keep things simple. Joseph. The name of the Father of Christ came to mind. Where are you from? A little here and there, he answered haphazardly, as if he found the question boring enough to barely consider. But before you ask me any questions, miss, how about you answer mine first? Do you believe in God? Not necessarily, I replied. I consider myself agnostic in that regard. Agnostic, huh? That's an interesting thing. How so? He raised a finger to point at me, something which caused me to instantly freeze where I stood. I couldn't tell if it was the underlying fear I had of this person, or some kind of control from his side, but the outcome was the same nonetheless. You believe in everything, yet nothing at the same time. Quite an oxymoron, wouldn't you say, miss? Before I could say anything in return, he slammed his hand onto the counter hard enough to cause a pen to roll to the floor. If you wouldn't mind, I would prefer to drink something. What can you offer me? It took me some time to gather my thoughts and form a sentence. My eyes landed on his slightly exposed wrist, and I could make out what looked like severe bruises on his skin. They seemed to stretch as far up as his sleeves would permit me to see. It was clear that wherever this kid had come from, it wasn't good. I can't serve you any alcohol. The look he sent me could have melted steel in frozen water at the same time. It was a clear indicator that he was not in the mood to have his demands denied. I would prefer a glass of wine, I don't need much. Giving in to his request could very much cost me my job, not to mention a ton of lawsuits, and his parents found out about this. I was sure to discover that Joseph's claim was indeed correct. None of the customers in the bar were looking at us. They were preoccupied, having a good time with whatever alcohol they had been served, as if there was nothing in the world that bothered them. Or maybe there was something that bothered them, but the liquor had done its job and made them forget about it, if only temporarily. I never thought the sight of that could ever make me feel so much pity for someone, like those who were trapped in blissful ignorance. Sighing, I poured half a glass of wine and put it on the counter. It was stupid of me, I know, but something told me that I was in for an unpleasant surprise if I thought that serving alcohol to a minor would become my biggest problem for the night. Joseph gave me an appreciative smile and reached for the glass, but he didn't drink it straight away like I thought he would. Instead, he just stared at it, shook the glass a bit to watch its content stain the sides of the transparent material, and then proceeded to tilt it up above him. Alcohol doesn't normally have an effect on me, he explained wistfully, as he continued to inspect the red liquid in his hand. But this is the closest thing I can get to the paradise the Lord has denied me. What are you talking about? He lowered his glass down a bit and looked at me through it, his golden eyes now covered in a red hue from where the wine had been. It was a mocking stunt from his side, you see. He made it so that nothing can relieve me from the agony I'm forced to endure. Except for this. He shook the glass a bit more, spilling a few drops on the counter. The blood of Christ, as they call it, right? His words weren't adding up at all, and for a moment I debated calling the authorities. However, given that I'd already provided a minor with a glass of alcohol, it could land me in a ton of trouble. Was that a risk I was willing to take? I'm afraid you lost me. I crossed my arms over my chest and leaned against the back of the bar, eyeing him inquisitively for answers that could give me some insight about this guy. Joseph pulled the glass up to his lips and took a gracious sip of it. By the time that he was finished, half of its contents was gone. He closed his eyes and savored its flavor like a child eating candy for the first time in years. It's sweet. That's good. I can't stand the bitter side of wine. He put the glass down again and released a half-baked chuckle. This time, it wasn't light, nor did it sound very youthful. The laugh was low and melancholic, like a grown man on the verge of breaking down after years of containing his frustrations. It's ironic. I spent seconds mocking the sun, and now I'm forced to indulge in what is considered to be his blood in order to get a glimpse of heaven. The sun? Whose son? I asked. His answer was not what I expected. God's son, of course, he uttered bitterly. His precious little baby. I wasn't sure if he was being metaphorical or serious, but from where I stood, I had a hard time believing he was being anything but mentally challenged at that point. Still, I kept calm and decided that it would be my best to keep the conversation going. You mean to tell me that you mocked Jesus Christ himself? I wasn't mocking him per se. Joseph explained and took a deep breath through his nostrils. I was criticizing him. For what? For what, she says, he mimicked. For dying. For giving his life to a lost cause. The poor fool. He died for our sins, I said, not realizing that I was defending the honor of a man I hadn't believed in since I was a child. Wasn't that the whole deal? To redeem us or something like that? Joseph looked up at me again, this time with a tired expression that could have made it seem like he hadn't slept in ages. He looked older now, by several years. The youthful boy who had walked into the bar but minutes earlier was nothing more than a shadow at this point, a long-forgotten memory. "And did that change anything?" he asked. "Are humanity void of guilt and sin to this day? Has world peace been achieved? Are children saved from the hands that hit and touch and corrupt? I've seen the world for what it is, and let me tell you, it's not been redeemed." He spent another moment trying to collect himself, and the smile that disappeared was back in place as though it had never left. "I was there when Jesus was sentenced by Pontius Pilate. I was there when he was forced to drag his cross across the earth and to his crucifixion. I was there as the nails were driven through his body, and I was there as he died on that cross. I was there throughout it all." With the way that he was retelling the story, I was almost tempted to believe this child. Granted, he talked and behaved as if he was much older than he looked like he was, but I wasn't quite convinced just yet that what he spoke was true. However, as I listened to his tale, I couldn't help but find it somehow familiar. The tale of someone who mocked Jesus Christ on the way to his execution was something that I had heard before, long ago when belief still resided in me. "What did you mock him about?" I asked. Joseph went quiet again, this time for much longer than he had before. The wine in his grip remained unmoved for the duration of his contemplative silence, and as I looked up at the clock, I realized that it wasn't too long until we closed. And then Joseph began to speak again, much quieter this time. "I didn't mock him. I simply asked him why he did it," he explained. "Why did you give up your life for something that cannot be remedied?" I asked. "Why do it when it won't change the outcome? Jesus Christ was an unbearably kind man. Of course, he had his flaws like any other person, but that kindness was what stood out about him. His love, his tolerance, his forgiveness. He was a good man, but he failed to see that humanity cannot be changed from what it already is, and telling him that was what earned me my sentence." He gulped down the rest of his drink in one go. It was made clear by that display that it wasn't the first time he had consumed alcohol, and I didn't know whether that impressed me or horrified me. "If you were there when Jesus Christ was still alive, then how come you are, well, still alive?" The moment I asked that question, the room seemed to freeze altogether. There was nothing there that appeared to move. The clock itself appeared to have stopped at 2:49, and as I glimpsed back at the few guests that were left in the bar, all I could see were shadows of those who were once there. Maybe I imagined it all, but something told me that whatever kind of powers this individual possessed, it could even make a non-believer doubt his ways in life. Joseph released a laugh so unnerving that the temperature dropped in the room. "That's my sentence," he calmly explained after his laughter died out. "Me calling out God and his beloved Son on their flaws earned me a one-way ticket to damnation, and that is here." Without even looking at me, he reached for the bottle of wine that I had left standing on top of the counter and poured himself another glass, this time to the brink. "I can't leave this place as much as I want to. I can't die the way you perceive death. Sweet miss, I can never reach heaven or hell. I'm stuck in a never-ending purgatory of pain, agony, and misery. and that is the price I have to pay for questioning his supposed gospel. Contrary to what people might think, God's love is not unconditional, nor is he all that benevolent. He can be kind, but he can be cruel when he sees the need to be it. The sheer contempt that resonated through his words could have made the world shake and crumble to dust. It was clear to me now that this boy wasn't ordinary, but I guess I had already put that together when he first entered the building. "What is your name?" I asked again. "Your real name." Joseph laughed at my question, but not as a way to taunt my ignorance. It seemed pitiful, like he was simultaneously surprised but saddened over the fact that I had asked him that. "I've had a lot of names throughout the years," he said. "Some have disappeared with the dust that once settled beneath my feet, but others exist in books and scripts of old and can still be found if you search for them. Joseph is one of my names, the one that's easier to understand, but there's also Ahasuerus and Matthias." "And which one would you prefer?" I asked. Which one would I prefer? To be honest, I don't have a preference anymore. But there is one name the people of the old faith still remember me by. He took me by my hand and shook it to mimic a greeting. His touch was cold to the bone, and I suppressed a shiver. If he noticed my discomfort, he didn't show it, or he simply didn't care. All he could do at that point was smile and introduce himself, as if we had just met. "My name is Cardophilus, but most people know me as the Wandering Jew." All pieces of the scattered puzzle came together in my head. Yes, I had heard that story. The story of the Wandering Jew. The man cursed by God for taunting Jesus on his way to the crucifixion. Cursed to wander the earth until the second coming. Never to know the joys of heaven and the suffering of hell. Yet forced to endure both at the same time for his offenses. Joseph, or Cardophilus, promptly let go of my hand. There was once again a smile on his face. "Do you believe me, miss?" I wanted to deny the possibilities that he was speaking the truth. By God, I wanted to keep myself in a blissful state of ignorance and say that this child was disturbed, mentally ill, and in no reliable state of being. There was no way that this boy, this child, was the same man who stood by Jesus Christ over 2,000 years ago. And yet a part of me believed him, even when I didn't want to. "How can I know for sure?" I asked, the skeptic within me coming back to life. "If you truly are the Wandering Jew, a man who existed so long ago, what kind of proof do you have?" He must have expected this because he reached for my hand, and the moment our fingers touched, a light flashed before my eyes. Blood filled my vision. The cries and screams of men, women, and children rang in the distance as they were damaged beyond what the world thought could be possible. The sight of bloodied battlefields and corpses stretched for as long as my vision could reach, while echoes of war and chaos erupted from all around me. There was so much pain, so much sadness to be felt, but all I could do as I watched the hell around me escalate was scream. I cried and I screamed with the many people who were victimized by the grueling events until my throat became raw from exhaustion and pain. But no matter how much I screamed, no help came my way. Only sorrow and suffering accompanied me throughout it all, and I desperately begged for salvation. I looked at the skies and I screamed for the one I knew would not respond, because he saw fit in making me suffer for my heinous crimes towards his beloved offspring. Almost as soon as it came, the visions disappeared and I was back in the bar, with tears streaming down my face and saliva pouring from my mouth by the ounces. I was a mess, and my throat still ached even though the lack of attention from the other patrons indicated that I hadn't done anything to warrant any weird looks. "It's not fun, is it?" Joseph asked innocently and tilted his head to the side, still holding my hand in his, as if it would bring me any consolation. I ripped my hand away from his like it was fire and quickly cleaned myself up with my sleeves. Words couldn't describe the agony that I was in. I wanted to beat the crap out of him for what he had done, make him feel as much pain as I felt. But something told me that he was already familiar enough with the sensation, so that it wouldn't have made a difference if I gave in to my anger. "What the heck did you do to me?" I was on the verge of screaming in his face, but I controlled myself just barely and kept my volume down to a hiss. Joseph was unfazed by my anger. "Interesting way of putting it, miss. In any case, I guess it is hell. Do you believe me now?" "What was that?" I seethed. "The consequences of Jesus' sacrifice. As you can see, it was all for naught. I'm guessing you saw the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Not a fine sight, I'll admit, but what can one do?" He sounded as if he was discussing the weather with me by the way his voice lacked any sign of being affected by what he had just shown me. In hindsight, I guess being alive for 2,000 years does something to a person's ability to face the seemingly unfaceable. Still shaking and sweating from the traumatic experience, without caring, I reached for the bottle of wine that rested on the counter and downed the rest of its content. I knew it was illegal for me to consume any liquor while on shift, but given what I had just been through, I could care less about it. "Are you all right, miss?" "Shut up," I snarled in between gulps. I must say, I'm impressed. The last person I gave such a sight to ended up being admitted to the closest psychiatric facility. You must have been through quite a lot in your life that you could stomach that. As I finished drinking the rest of the wine, I slammed the bottle down on the counter hard enough to leave a significant mark, and I glared at the boy sitting across from me. "Let's say I believe you for now, but how the heck are you so young? The wandering Jew that I read about was an old shoemaker or something. So why do you look like you just reached puberty?" That is a valid question." He placed a finger under his chin and tried to concoct a sufficient answer. "As I said, I can't die the way you perceive death. I can still feel pain and suffer like any other person. But here's the catch. Every time I die, I'm simply reborn into another body. Death for me is but a moment of darkness, and shortly after, I'm brought back through another womb, by another woman, in another country. Death is short, and the pain that follows lasts for eternity. If I were to die now in this bar, I simply would be born someplace else right after." "So you're reincarnated?" "Precisely," he confirmed with a snap of his fingers. He reached for his glass and downed the wine all at once, not stopping to catch his breath for even a second. As I watched him, I couldn't help but pity the man that lurked beneath the skin of that young boy. Thousands of years of pain, all because he didn't agree with the views of the man in the clouds. Where did that leave him? Right here in a bar like every other miserable man in existence. I couldn't tell if it was the effects of the alcohol that were affecting me, or my curiosity in general, but I felt compelled to ask him the question that had been stuck in my head for far too long now. "Do you still believe it?" I asked. When he finished drinking, he turned to me again and quirked an eyebrow. "Believe what?" "That humanity's beyond redemption." He put the glass back down and smiled once more, a sad smile. "Do you?" he asked. I thought about it for a while, but eventually concluded that after what I had seen in the world, after what my father had done with me, and after everything I had been through, there was no hope. I didn't want to admit it, but what Joseph showed me was nothing short of how the world was today. War, brutality, inequality, pain. How was humanity supposed to redeem themselves when they hadn't changed at all in the past 2,000 years? I didn't exclude myself from the rest. I wasn't Mama's favorite child either. But if God was punishing a man for simply stating his opinion, what was the point of free will? What was the point of anything if it always landed us here in the end? I had been in this world for a little over 20 years, but this person in front of me had seen the rest of humanity these past millenniums, and yet our opinions were the same. No, I answered. I don't. Joseph flashed me a sincere smile again. It's been a while since I've had a conversation like this. I've had many mothers, many fathers, siblings, wives, husbands, children's friends, enemies, and everything in between. But none of them have quite been capable of providing the sort of companionship you've given me. Thank you for lending me your ear, miss. When is your sentence finished, Joseph? I caught myself asking. He released a tired sigh. I honestly don't know. He isn't elaborative about his plans, so I doubt any of us will ever know when the second coming arrives. If one thing's certain, it's that I'm not bound to escape this prison of mine anytime soon. He reached over the counter and touched my cheek, an affectionate gesture that nearly made tears build up in my eyes. Take this advice from me, miss. Divine neglect is nothing compared to its wrath. Value your life, because it is only temporary. With that, he made a move to do something. I expected him to make his way out the door, but he simply stood there by the counter. His eyes lingered on top of his empty glass. I'm sorry, but that was our last bottle, I said, but he didn't seem any less interested in it. One last time, he flashed me a smile and then reached for the glass. Before I could process what was happening, I watched as he raised it above his head and slammed it down against the counter. Shards went flying in every direction, and I had to dodge us to not get a piece of it in me. The moment I got back up, I was horrified to see that Joseph held the shard close enough to his throat to draw blood. Just as I was about to reach for him to prevent him from doing whatever he intended to do, he drew it all the way across his neck. It left behind a significant red cut that not even seconds later erupted with so much blood that it soaked the floorboards, his clothing, and splattered over everything within a 5-feet radius, including me. My white shirt was covered with so much blood that I looked about ready to audition for the role of Carrie, but it was nothing compared to how Joseph looked. My first instinct wasn't to address how I looked, but to jump across the counter into the bleeding body before he could hit the floor. It was hard to keep a straight face as I bent to my knees and picked the boy up, watching as the color slowly drained from his face and blood continued to pour from his wound. I hastily tried to reach for the towel that rested over the counter and stop the bleeding, but Joseph took my hand before I could, and his golden eyes appeared at me. He seemed so peaceful, like he wasn't in any pain at all. I didn't understand. Why? I whispered. Joseph merely smiled a tired but contented smile at me. This life was so tedious. He struggled to pronounce just as more blood made its way past his lips and down his neck. Hopefully, I get a more entertaining one next time. He put a blood-soaked hand on my cheek, caressing me fondly like a master would their beloved pet. It left behind a stain that would stay with me for years to come. I am happy, though, for having met someone like you, miss. Joseph released another cough that splattered blood on my uniform, but I barely noticed it. All I could focus on was the dying person in my arms. But if God is truly kind, we won't meet again. That was the last thing Joseph said before his golden eyes closed for good, and all I was left with was an empty vessel. The cops arrived not too long after I had called them. They took this statement from everyone who had been at the bar at the time of the incident, but none of them had admitted that they had seen or heard anything of the conversation that I shared with the young boy. All they said was that they saw him come in. There probably came the sound of something being broken, and the next thing anyone with a smidgen of sobriety knew, there was a dead body on the floor. The body was later identified to be that of a 14-year-old boy named Christian O'Connell. His father was an abusive alcoholic, and his mother was a neglectful woman. The authorities ruled this incident as self-inflicted because of this, as they probably guessed that he had simply ended himself because of his violent home life. The officers initially assumed that I was involved, or at the very least had given the boy something to drink that could have resulted in his reckless actions. I was interrogated and everything, but I could only share with them what I knew they would believe, that the boy had come in, and after I told him that he needed to leave, he ended himself. Still, they didn't believe me at first, but after the autopsy was conducted, they shared that there wasn't a spot of alcohol in his system, so I was out of harm's way. I didn't dare contradict them on this theory. I'd rather believe it myself, had these circumstances been different. Shortly after the incident, I quit my job and moved away from the city altogether. I wanted to put everything that had happened behind me, and the first step to do so was to find another place to live and a new job. I began to work as a waitress at a cafe in the new city. It wasn't good in terms of pay, but it was predictable, and given what I'd been through, it was all that I wanted now. A predictable, safe life, void of anything even remotely strange. A life that I could appreciate and value. At some point, a couple of years later, I met the man who would become my fiancé and eventual husband. Things were going well, and not long after we got engaged, I became pregnant with our first child. It didn't matter to any of us that the child was born before we were married. All we cared about was that we were happy and that everything was going well. After I gave birth, I was so happy to know that our child was healthy. A healthy, beautiful baby boy. We named him Nicholas, after my husband's father. The moment that I first held him in my arms, still warm from the months that he had spent growing inside of my womb, I felt such love for him that it could never compare to anything else. Not even the affection I had for my husband. I just knew that I wanted to care for him, watch him grow and thrive, and protect him from whatever the world would throw at him. However, as happy as I was to hold my baby in my arms, I noticed something that probably placed a heavy weight on my body. Nicholas's eyes were golden. I tried to think rationally as a new mother, and consulted with the doctors about the cause of Nicholas's eyes. They said that it may have been caused by some kind of genetic but rare defect, and as long as his vision wasn't impaired in any way, then there was doubtfully anything to worry about. A couple of years passed, and to me and my husband's relief, Nicholas developed just like any other boy. He was happy, cheerful, and possessed enough energy to drive us to the brink of exhaustion every day. He was a good boy, and no amount of words or actions will ever be enough to express how much I love him. I started to believe that what the doctors had said to me was true, and that the cause of Nicholas's eyes was nothing remotely linked to anything supernatural. One day, while I was in the kitchen washing some dishes, I heard Nicholas shuffle behind me, no doubt trying to surprise me. It was a fun activity for him, trying to be sneaky. For the sake of amusing him, I would feign surprise. However, as I turned around and prepared for Nicholas to raise his arms and roar like he always would, I became genuinely surprised to see him simply standing there, a smile plastered on his face. "Mommy," he said, "I'm glad." "What are you so glad about, sweetie?" I asked. What he said next shook me to the core. "I'm glad that you're my new mommy, Miss."